All right, so when we left off working on the Metamorphosis project, assignment 11, we had finished our storyboard. I had thought of my idea of taking this egg and cracking it and having it be kind of a environmental message or a science fiction stand-in for the planet exploding, something like that. And I really thought about what I needed to do in terms of setting up the shots and lighting the shots and settings in the camera and trying to do it as much with manual settings as possible so it would stay constant. And I was able to do everything except use artificial light. And I found I got best light from using the window, but of course natural light will change moment to moment. So there are little changes there. But these were my exposures. Just a whole bunch of them. Started out with some tests. So I figured out kind of what level of focus I wanted. So that's the dyed egg. What viewpoint I wanted. So different types of lighting. Different angles, different exposure rates, trying to figure out my manual settings. Underexposing, overexposing, that's what's called bracketing. Figuring out what the right level was, and this was about the right level. And then it became all about finding the right point of view with the right exposure, with the right level of focus, and then trying to make that as standard as possible. So this is where I started my exposures. So that's number 406. So everything before that was basically just testing it. Okay, and then I have from 406 all the way down to 446, so 40 different exposures. Cracking it, sometimes the cracking moved it a little bit too much. And then breaking it apart. Because I'm using manual settings, sometimes the focus is lost, and I decided I wanted to keep that. So it's focused on this area. So as it gets behind that, it gets less and less in focus and feels more and more like an explosion that fades away. All right, so one way you can kind of get a sense of how everything looks is just by looking at how it plays in your preview window. Think of it as the storyboard. So I might have started my exposures with 406, but maybe they don't really get going until 415 or so. And there might be a few that just don't work out. So, before I bring them into Photoshop, I want to make a new folder of my cleanest shots. Okay, so when I open them up, I want to know where I start and stop. And if you took a lot of exposures, this is an extremely important step. If you only took a few exposures, you just want to make sure you see the problems. And we need at least 9. So I start with 406, but 407 looks like it's a little bit more in focus. And then I changed lighting around 411, and then I kept that lighting consistent. No, I didn't. I changed back. So really, my start is going to be about 415. So 415 is my first clean exposure. So I'm going to drag that over. It'll make a duplicate. Now this one, 416, not much changes. I tapped on it with a spoon and it started to crack, but it's so little and it moved the egg in a way I didn't like. So instead, I'm going to jump right to 419. So in this way, we can edit out the steps that aren't that helpful. And then 420, where the crack gets bigger and bigger. And then 421. Then 422. Then 423. And then it's pretty much in a rhythm. And even though the egg would start to move a lot in different exposures, just because I had to kind of pry it open, and even though I try to place it, it starts to move. I'm going to take all of those exposures as being important to show the transformation and move them all into this new folder. And now with my clean exposures, I can open that up in preview and see if it tells the story more clearly. And it does. And I can see that 415 is pretty much the same as 419, except that the egg has shifted over. So I can see that there's some aspects of alignment I'll need to work with. Okay, now I have that folder of clean exposures on my desktop. What I do is I open up Photoshop, as we did in our tests, and I say File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and then select the files from that folder that's on my desktop. So it means these are my clean transformation exposures. So I'm going to take all of those, open them up, and depending on what they are, you can attempt to automatically align them. I am not going to do that because I have a blank background, so I'm going to align them by hand. And when it opens them up in Photoshop, it's simply going to load one exposure per layer, and it will build the layers up on top of each other. Because they were all taken with the same camera at the same resolution settings, they should all fill the same rectangle, the same grid of pixels. And why we load them into a stack is that now they will all be in one Photoshop file. So immediately now I want to save this as my assignment 11 exposures as a Photoshop file to the desktop. And now all my exposures that I want to use are here in my layers. I will get back to this later, so I'm going to close that for now. And now my concern is lining all the shots up. And I know that this first one gets off center right away. So there's a few ways I can do this. I can use the grid and I can use guides. So basically, I can use the move tool in my guides and the grid and box in my egg. And that way I could take this top layer and make it fit in that box. I can use my arrow keys as well with the move tool. And the reason for doing that is without the grid or the guide, it will show that that egg is in the exact same position. And then I can simply use the grid and the guide and make sure my other layers are also lined up. With a circle like this, it's pretty easy to do. So I just turn them off, turn them on, angle them into position. Now the key is that we want the viewer to pay attention to the movement, to the change in our subject matter, the metamorphosis, the transformation. And in order to really make that strong in the content, we have to take away everything else. And the first thing we want to take away is any kind of movement that we can control. And that's why I shot with extra space around the subject so that I can crop into it. I eventually will crop these all into a square, but not necessarily this square. This is just to help me line up the egg. And by locking it to guides like this, instead of just using transparency and trying to put it to the frame before, I have an objective standard I'm trying to match all of them to. Now that will become more and more difficult as the egg becomes less and less of a sphere. And I'm not doing any color processing yet. I'm just trying to get the placement. And now that sphere is getting wonky, less spherical. As the egg starts to break apart. Now this is why it's important that I used manual settings. I wasn't zooming in or changing any of that. And I was using the same exposure for each. The only thing that would change slightly is the natural light coming in from the window. That was lighting this. All right, from here on out, I'm going to turn off the grid, and I'm going to show you the other way you can do it. So if I have them all turned on here, without using the guides and the grid, I've set this up. I could simply take the opacity down about halfway on the shot and line them up that way. But I know that that works for all of these. See. But once the egg gets broken open, especially between those two steps, it gets pretty significantly different. So what I'm going to do is use opacity, and I'm going to try to line up something that doesn't change. And I do that by lining up the one underneath. Whoops. So this layer, I'm going to try to line up the shell on one side, at least somewhat. Then when I put it back to 100%,